At 10 p.m. on August 23, 1944, Sergeant Bob Tompkins crouched low behind a thick hedgerow outside Brest, France. The night air was damp and heavy, carrying the distant rumble of artillery. Just 2 kilometers away, German anti-tank guns were positioned, waiting for real targets. Tompkins wasn't giving them real targets, he was inflating one, a rubber tank. At 27 years old, this was his 4th deception operation. He had never destroyed a single enemy tank. Not because he wasn't capable, but because none of his targets were real, and neither were his own. Across the battlefield, 38,000 German troops defended Fortress Brest, one of the last major ports still under Nazi control in western France. The city was heavily fortified, its defenses hardened over years of occupation. And tonight, Tompkins and his unit were about to trick them. He connected a portable air compressor to the limp, folded shape of what would soon become a full-sized M4 Sherman tank. Around him, men from the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion worked in near silence. They had driven nearly 190 miles through rain and mud that day, pushing themselves to exhaustion. No sleep, no hot food, no rest, only orders. Simulate 2 full tank battalions. Convince the Germans that 30,000 American troops were massing for an attack on their right flank. Do it with just 1,100 men and inflatable rubber. The compressor hissed to life. Slowly the tank began to rise, first the hull, then the turret, then the long cannon bell. In the dim moonlight, the transformation was almost surreal, like watching something come alive. The finished product would weigh just 93 pounds. A real Sherman tank weighed over 33 tons. This one could be carried by 4 men. It would collapse if someone leaned on it too hard, but from a distance it was convincing. From 500 yards it looked real. From 800 yards, through binoculars, it looked deadly, and Tompkins knew exactly who was watching. Earlier that evening, he had scanned the area with field glasses and spotted movement in a church tower in the nearby village of Gauesneu. 2 figures stood silhouetted against the faint glow of the horizon, German observers, artillery spotters. They were likely watching right now, mapping coordinates, preparing firing solutions. Tompkins didn't stop working, that was the point. The Ghost Army didn't hide from the enemy, they wanted to be seen. Officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army was unlike any unit in military history. They didn't rely on firepower, they relied on illusion. Their weapons were deception, creativity, and psychological warfare. Inflatable tanks and artillery pieces that looked real from a distance. Sound trucks that blasted recordings of armored divisions moving into position. Radio operators who mimicked entire units, copying communication patterns so precisely that German intelligence couldn't tell the difference. Artists who painted fake insignia on vehicles, making a handful of jeeps look like part of a much larger force. Activated in January 1944, the unit consisted of just 1,100 men. But they were carefully selected. Their average WASQ was 119 higher than most combat units. They were artists, engineers, actors, designers, and technicians, men like Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly, a future modern art pioneer. Art Kane, who would go on to photograph some of the most iconic images in jazz history. They were an unlikely army. West Point graduates worked alongside art school dropouts. Broadway set designers trained next to mechanical engineers. They had one mission, convince the enemy that something existed. When it didn't, Tompkins checked his watch. 2:30 a.m. time was slipping away. They had just a few hours left before dawn. Task Force X needed 15 Sherman tanks fully inflated in position before sunrise. So far they had 4. Captain Oscar Seal, the officer in charge of Task Force X, moved between teams, quietly issuing instructions. His unit of 200 men was tasked with simulating the 15th Tank Battalion. They had one real tank company attached from the 709th Tank Battalion. Everything else was fake. Tompkins looked down the line of equipment, 11 more tanks to go. At 6 a.m., German reconnaissance aircraft would begin their morning sweeps. Luftwaffe pilots flying high above the battlefield, cameras ready, scanning for signs of Allied movement. If the tanks looked fake, the operation would fail. If they looked real, German artillery would open fire, 88mm anti-tank guns, high explosive shells capable of tearing apart real armor. Against rubber tanks, they would be devastating, and against the men standing next to them, even worse. Private James Anderson stepped forward, wiping mud from his hands. Back home, he had been an auto mechanic in Virginia. Now he operated a bulldozer not to build defenses, but to create the illusion of them. He carefully dragged the blade across soft ground, carving deep, realistic tracks into the mud. Patterns mattered, spacing mattered, direction mattered. The goal wasn't just to place fake tanks, it was to make it look like dozens of real ones had moved through the area. Anderson worked methodically, studying the terrain, adjusting angles, making sure every mark told the right story. Nearby, another team stretched camouflage netting over the inflated tanks. Others arranged equipment to suggest human presence, dashed discarded gear, ration boxes, even fake sleeping positions. Every detail added to the illusion. Suddenly, the compressor sparked, then stopped. Tompkins froze. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He dropped to his knees, quickly checking the hose. A blockage. He cleared it, restarted the machine. The hiss returned. The tank resumed its slow, unnatural growth. Time was slipping. By 3 a.m., the head inflated 13 tanks. Close, but not enough. Anderson continued carving tracks. Men moved quickly but carefully, avoiding unnecessary noise. At 3:30, the final element arrived. The sound truck. A modified vehicle equipped with powerful speakers and pre-recorded audio. The operators set it up behind a line of hedges and powered it on. Moments later, the night filled with sound. Low, rumbling engine noise, metal clacking, voices shouting orders. The sounds of an armored unit preparing for battle. It was carefully calibrated. Too loud and it would sound artificial. Too quiet and German listening posts wouldn't pick it up. They needed to strike the perfect balance, and they did. Dawn began to break at 6:12 a.m. A faint glow spread across the horizon, revealing the shapes of the inflatable tanks. From a distance, they looked convincing. Dangerous enough. At 6:47, the sound of an aircraft echoed overhead. Turned upward. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane flying at approximately 3,000 feet. It made one pass, then another. Cameras clicking as it captured images of the battlefield below. No one moved, no one spoke. They simply watched. Then the plane turned and disappeared into the distance. The waiting began. Minutes felt like hours. By noon, word came in from 8th Corps Intelligence. German radio traffic had been intercepted. They were reacting. Artillery units were repositioning. Between 20 and 50 anti-tank guns were being moved toward the fake tanks. The deception had worked quickly, but now those guns were aimed directly at them. 6 months earlier, none of this existed. No inflatable tanks, no sound trucks, no deception unit, just an idea. In January 1944, in a London office, Major Ralph Ingersoll studied reconnaissance photographs from North Africa. The British had successfully used deception against German forces under General Erwin Rommel. Dummy tanks, fake supply depots, carefully staged illusions. Rommel had been fooled. Ingersoll turned to Colonel Billy Hess. "We need this," he said, "for Normandy. We need this for Normandy." Colonel Billy Harris didn't respond immediately. He kept staring at the reconnaissance photos spread across the table. Grainy black and white images of the North African desert, fake tank formations, dummy artillery, carefully staged illusions that had convinced one of Germany's most respected commanders, Erwin Rommel, that an attack was coming from the wrong direction. And it had worked, not just once, repeatedly. Harris finally looked up. "The British pulled this off in the desert," he said slowly. "Open terrain, long sight lines, minimal cover." He tapped the table. "Normandy isn't a desert." He was right. France was different. Dense hedgerows, fidges, forests, narrow roads, limited visibility, and most importantly, German forces that had spent 4 years preparing defenses. They weren't going to be fooled easily. But the stakes were too high. The Allies were planning the largest amphibious invasion in history. Over 150,000 troops would land on 5 beaches in a single day. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword. If the Germans knew where the invasion was coming, they could concentrate their forces and crush it before it even began. Harris leaned back in his chair. "We don't just need deception," he said. "We need scale." Approval came quickly. By early January 1944, orders were issued. Activate a specialized unit. Mission: deceive the enemy about Allied strength, position, and intentions. Save lives through illusion. The first problem wasn't equipment. It wasn't strategy. It was people. Who do you recruit for a unit whose job is to lie convincingly on a battlefield? Combat soldiers knew how to fight. Engineers knew how to build. Signal operators knew how to transmit. But deception? That required something different. It required imagination. Harris and his team began looking for men with unusual skill sets. Artists who understood light, shadow, and perspective. Sound engineers who could recreate realistic audio environments. Radio operators who could mimic communication paths down to the smallest detail. Actors who could play roles under pressure convincingly, consistently, and without breaking character. Recruitment began in late January. Men were pulled from existing units. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion became the backbone of visual deception. The 244th Signal Company was assigned to handle radio operations. A new sonic unit was formed for audio deception. Additional engineers were brought in for support and security, but Harris didn't stop there. He reached beyond traditional military roles. Fashion designers, painters, set designers from Broadway, illustrators, even advertising professionals. Men who understood how to create illusions not just physically, but psychologically. By February, the unit began to take shape. 1,100 and average IQ 119. One of the most intellectually diverse units ever assembled in the U.S. Army. Command of the unit was given to Colonel Harry Reeder, a seasoned officer and former commander of the 46th Armored Infantry Regiment. Reeder understood traditional warfare. But this was something entirely new. There were no manuals, no established doctrine, no proven strategies for large-scale battlefield deception. They were building everything from scratch. Training began at Camp Forest, Tennessee, and it was unlike anything the Army had ever attempted. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson was tasked with developing the training program. His challenge was enormous. How do you teach soldiers to create illusions under combat conditions? The answer, you break the process down, piece by piece. First, visual deception. Men were trained to inflate dummy tanks, and under 20 minutes speed mattered. They would often be working at night under pressure, sometimes within range of enemy observation. They practiced positioning angles, spacing. From the ground, inflatable tanks looked ridiculous, wrinkled rubber, slightly uneven shapes, but from 500 yards, they looked real. From the air, even more convincing. They learned how to use terrain to their advantage, how to place decoys in shadows, how to simulate realistic formations, how to make a fake army look alive. Second sound, this was experimental. The army had never attempted large-scale sonic deception before. Special trucks were equipped with powerful speakers capable of projecting sound over long distances. Recordings were created in controlled environments. Tank engines starting and stopping, tracks grinding over dirt roads, metal clanging, officers shouting commands, soldiers talking, laughing, moving equipment. The key wasn't just volume, it was realism. Sound had to match the terrain, it had to echo correctly, had to change based on distance and direction. Too perfect and it would sound fake. Too chaotic and it would lose credibility. They practiced constantly, adjusting levels, testing playback, learning how to create the illusion of movement. Third, radio deception. This was perhaps the most complex element. German intelligence relied heavily on intercepted communications. They listened, analyzed, tracked patterns. Every real American unit had a communication signature, call signs, message formats, timing, even individual operator habits. The Ghost Army had to replicate all of it perfectly. Radio operators studied real units for weeks. They learned how specific divisions communicated, how often they transmitted, what kinds of messages did they send. They even mimicked typing rhythms and transmission quirks. The goal wasn't just to send messages, it was to create a believable network, an entire division. That didn't exist. Finally, performance. Every soldier in the Ghost Army had to become an actor. They wore fake unit patches, used the names of real divisions, spoke casually in public about movements that weren't happening. They visited cafes, started conversations, accidentally revealed information. Always with the hope that someone was listening, someone who would pass that information along to German intelligence. By April 1944, the unit was ready, at least as ready as they could be. 1,100 men, 4 specialized components: visual deception, sonic deception, radio deception, security. Together they formed something entirely new, a weaponized illusion. On April 10th, an advance party flew to England. Colonel Reeder and 6 officers, their mission, figure out how to integrate deception into the upcoming invasion. They had less than 2 months. The main force followed in early May. They crossed the Atlantic aboard the USS General Henry W. Gibbons. 13 days at sea, uncertainty, anticipation, and a growing realization they were about to test something that had never been done before. They arrived in Bristol on May 15th, 2 weeks before today. By then, Operation Fortitude was already underway, a massive Allied deception campaign designed to convince Hitler that the invasion would occur at Pasto, Calais, not Normandy. Fake armies, phantom divisions, and equipment, double agents feeding false information. The Ghost Army would support this effort, but Reeder faced a serious problem. His men had trained in Tennessee, controlled conditions, no enemy, no real danger. Now they would be operating within range of German artillery. If their deception looked fake, the mission would fail. If it looked too real, they would become targets. And 1,100 lightly armed men could not survive a determined German attack. Day came and went. June 6, 1944. The largest invasion in history. The Ghost Army wasn't there. They were still in England, meeting, training, preparing. While thousands of Allied soldiers fought and died on the beaches of Normandy, the Ghost Army inflated practice tanks. It was frustrating, but their time was coming. On June 21st, their first detachment crossed the English Channel. 20 men, one mission. Simulate a Mulberry Harbor at night using lights. Draw German artillery fire away from the real artificial harbors. It was their first real test, and it almost worked too well. The problem wasn't that the deception failed, it was that the real coastline was already filled with lights. So many ships, so much activity. Their contribution blended in. But the mission taught them something critical. German artillery spotters were watching constantly, calculating, waiting for targets. The full unit arrived in France on June 23rd. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air. Burned-out vehicles lined the roads. The reality of war hit them immediately. This wasn't training anymore, this was real. Their first major operation came in July. Supporting General Patton's Third Army, the situation was chaotic. American forces were advancing rapidly across France. The Germans didn't know where the main thrust was, and that confusion was an opportunity. The Ghost Army would amplify it. They split into multiple task forces, each one assigned to simulate a different division: 35th Infantry Division, 80th Infantry Division, 90th Infantry Division. Real divisions continued moving east. The Ghost Army created the illusion that those same divisions were moving elsewhere, west-south, anywhere but their actual location. The execution was precise. Radio operators generated constant traffic, convincing detail, consistent. Sound trucks played recordings of true movements. Vehicles were marked with fake insignia. Soldiers wore incorrect patches on purpose. They entered towns, visited cafes, talked openly about movements that weren't happening. Every action was calculated, every word intentional. German intelligence intercepted the signals, analyzed the pattern, and believed them. Reports indicated multiple American divisions moving into areas where none actually existed. German forces were repositioned, resources diverted, and while they reacted, Patton's real army pushed forward unopposed. By the time the Germans realized the truth, it was too late. The real American advance had already gained momentum. And the Ghost Army had proven something critical. Deception worked, not just in theory, but in real combat. But success brought a new problem. Now everyone wanted them, every commander, every operation request flooded in. Use the Ghost Army here, simulate a division there, create a diversion on this flank. But deception wasn't simple. It required time, planning, precision. One mistake could expose everything, and exposure meant death. Success was a problem. The Ghost Army had just proven that deception could work on a large scale, not just small tricks, not just isolated illusions. Entire divisions could be faked, entire battles could be influenced. And now every commander wanted a piece of that power. Requests flooded in from across the front. Simulate an armored push or create a diversion there. Make the Germans believe something, anything that would give Allied forces an advantage. But what looked simple on paper was incredibly dangerous in reality, because deception only worked if the enemy noticed you, and if the enemy noticed you, you became a target. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Day understood that better than most. During operations near Brest, he had volunteered for a dangerous assignment establishing radio contact with notional units inside contested territory. That meant driving forward, closer to German lines, closer to artillery, closer to everything the Ghost Army was trying to manipulate. At one point, Day entered a city still under active German fire. He helped coordinate confusion, assisted advancing forces, and even played a role in the capture of over 300 German soldiers. For his actions, he would later receive the Bronze Star, but what he saw there stayed with him. If the Germans ever realized the truth, if they ever discovered that these units weren't real, the response would be immediate and brutal. The men began to understand something unsettling. They weren't just supporting the battle, they were baked. James Anderson wrote it in his diary. We're not soldiers in the usual sense, we're targets pretending to be something worth shooting at. And he wasn't wrong. The Ghost Army's job was to look dangerous, to appear valuable, to convince the enemy that they were worth attacking. But to do that, they had to place themselves in visible, vulnerable positions, forward observation zones, artillery range, sniper distance. There was no safe way to do what they were doing. By late August, as Sergeant Tompkins inflated rubber tanks outside Brest, the unit had completed multiple deception operations. 5 major missions, 0 catastrophic failures, but not without cost. 3 men had already been killed, dozens wounded, most by artillery, not targeted, not deliberate, just bad luck, wrong time, too close to the front, and they knew their luck wouldn't last forever because patterns were forming. German intelligence wasn't stupid. They were watching, listening, analyzing. Why did certain American units only appear at night? Why did some divisions generate heavy radio traffic but never attack? Why did armored formations vanish without leaving wreckage? These questions were building, and eventually they would lead to answers. Back outside Brest, Tompkins stood quietly, watching the early morning light stretch across the field. Rows of inflatable Shermans sat in position, perfectly arranged, perfectly convincing. Somewhere in the distance, German artillery crews were preparing their guns, loading shells, adjusting elevation, calculating trajectories, preparing to destroy what they believed was a major armored threat. The illusion was complete. Now came the dangerous part, surviving it. At 4 a.m., hours before the real American attack began, Task Force X received orders. Withdrawal. Immediately. This was standard procedure. Create the illusion, then disappear before the enemy could verify it. Men moved quickly. Valves were opened. Air hissed out of the rubber tanks. Within minutes, massive armored shapes collapsed into flat sheets. The same tanks that had looked like 33-ton war machines just hours earlier were now nothing more than folded rubber. They were packed onto trucks, loaded secure. By the time the sun fully rose, there was nothing left. At 6 a.m., 8th Corps launched its assault on Fortress Brest. 75,000 American troops moved into position. The 2nd Infantry Division attacked from the north. The 8th Infantry Division struck the center. The 29th pushed from the south. The battle began, and it didn't go as planned. German defenses were stronger than expected. Deeply fortified bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, hidden machine gun nests. The kind of defenses built over years, not days. American forces advanced slowly, painfully. In the first 8 hours, they gained just 200 yards. Casualties mounted quickly. Over 300 men were wounded or killed on the first day alone. But something had changed. German anti-tank guns were not where they were expected to be. Intelligence reports confirmed it. Between 20 and 50 anti-tank weapons had been repositioned, moved to counter a threat that didn't exist, the Ghost Army's fake tanks. On the right flank, Company D of the 709th Tank Battalion reported lighter resistance than anticipated. Less anti-tank fire, fewer obstacles, safer movement. The deception hadn't won the battle, but it had shifted the odds, even slightly, and in war, sometimes that was enough. The battle for Brest would last 27 days, brutal, relentless. By the end, over 10,000 American casualties had been recorded. The German garrison was eventually destroyed or captured, but victory came at a cost. For the Ghost Army, there was no celebration, no recognition, no pause. As soon as one operation ended, another began. On September 8, 1944, new orders arrived. Operation Bettenberg. General Patton's forces were pushing toward the fortress city of Metz, but there was a problem. A gap had formed in the American lines, a dangerous one. If German forces discovered it and launched a counterattack, they could split Allied forces, cut off entire divisions, turn momentum into disaster. There were no reserves available, no reinforcements to fill the gap except one unit, 1,100 men. With inflatable tanks, the Ghost Army was ordered to hold the line, not with weapons, but with illusion. This mission was different from the rest. There, they had supported a real attack. Here, they were the only thing standing between two vulnerable positions. If the Germans probed the line, they wouldn't find soldiers. They would find actors. Lieutenant Robert Hiller took charge of the sonic deception. His trucks were positioned just behind the front, hidden, protected as much as possible. At night, they came live. Tank engines roared through speakers. Troops assembled. Commands echoed across the fields. The sound of an entire division preparing for battle. But there was no division, only recordings. Radio deception intensified. Signal operators created a complete communication network. Fake headquarters, fake battalions, fake supply lines. Hundreds of messages transmitted daily, each one carefully crafted, each one believable. They didn't just simulate activity, they created a story, a living, breathing military presence. German artillery responded, sporadic at first, harassment fire, testing, probing. Shells landed near positions, explosions ripped through the air, shrapnel tore into the ground. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were wounded during the operation. They had been setting up equipment, wrong place, wrong one again. But the Germans never discovered the truth. Reconnaissance failed to detect the gap. No major assault came. Patton's advance continued. After 7 days, real American units moved in. The Ghost Army withdrew quietly. As always, Colonel Reeder reviewed the reports. Operation Brittany, Operation West, Operation Benberg, all successful, no major failures. Casualties remarkably low considering the risks, but the trend was clear. Each mission was getting harder, more dangerous, closer to the front. And the psychological strain was building. Combat soldiers knew their role, engage the enemy, take cover, advance when ordered. The Ghost Army, they had to stand still, be seen, be convincing, while shells fell around them without firing. Like every mission required discipline, restraint, control. Because one wrong move, one inconsistency, one mistake could expose everything. And if that happened, they wouldn't just fail. They would become the enemy's highest priority target. By December 1944, the war in Europe had changed. For months, Allied forces had been advancing across France. Cities were falling. German defenses were weakening. Victory felt close, too close, because on December 16th at 5:30 a.m., everything changed. Without warning, German artillery opened fire across a 50-mile front in the Ardennes forest. It wasn't a small attack, it was massive. 29 divisions, over 250,000 German troops, tanks, infantry, artillery. Hitler's final gamble in the West. The goal was simple and dangerous. Break through Allied lines, split American and British forces, capture the port of Antwerp. Force the Allies into a negotiated peace. The assault caught everyone off guard. American units were stretched thin. Many were resting, reorganizing, not expecting a major offensive. Within hours, German armored divisions punched through weak points in the line. Entire battalions were surrounded. Communication broke down. Roads became chaos. Retreating vehicles, advancing tanks, wounded soldiers trying to escape. No one knew exactly where the Germans were or how far they had advanced. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. And in the middle of that chaos sat the Ghost Army. They were positioned in Luxembourg, roughly 60 miles from the initial breakthrough, far enough to avoid immediate contact, close enough to Major General Omar Bradley needed options fast. He needed to slow the German advance, confuse their command by time, but there was a problem. There were no reserves. Every available American unit was already committed, except 1,100, and no tanks, no artillery, no heavy weapons, just radios and imagination. Bradley's staff proposed something unusual, a new kind of deception. No inflatable tanks, no sound trucks, just radio. Operation Kodak. The idea was simple. Create the illusion that 2 full American divisions were moving into position south of the German breakthrough. Phantom reinforcements, fake strength to make German intelligence believe that fresh forces were arriving, forcing them to hesitate, to divert, to delay. But this mission was different from anything the Ghost Army had done before. There would be no visual cover, no physical illusion, just signals, just voices in the air. And if the Germans decided to act on those signals, they could strike directly at the source. On December 19th, the operation began. Radio operators set up in frozen fields, truck-mounted transmitters humming in the cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing, equipment struggled. Vacuum tubes cracked, fingers went numb. But the transmissions continued. They impersonated 2 real divisions, the 75th Infantry Division, the 6th Armored Division, both powerful, well-known combat units, both believable choices for reinforcement. The fake 75th Infantry Division began transmitting first. Supply requests, movement orders, reconnaissance reports, routine traffic, everything a real division would send while moving into position. It wasn't just about volume, it was about detail, consistency, authenticity. Every message followed exact military protocol. Every transmission matched known communication patterns. Even operator habits were copied. Timing, pauses, signal rhythm, nothing was left to chance. Then came the 6th Armored Division, even more complex. Tank maintenance logs, fuel reports, artillery coordination messages, hundreds of transmissions per day, all suggesting a powerful armored force preparing to counterattack. German intelligence was listening always. Their signal interception units picked up the transmissions almost immediately. Direction-finding equipment began triangulating locations, mapping movement, tracking patterns, building a picture. And picture was clear. American reinforcements were arriving, 2 full divisions moving into position, preparing to engage. German commanders reacted. They had to, because ignoring such a threat could be catastrophic. If those divisions attacked at the right moment, they could stop the German advance completely. So they hesitated, they adjusted, they diverted attention.
Exactly what the Ghost Army
needed, but the risk was growing. Every transmission made them more visible. Radio signals could be tracked, located. If German artillery locked onto their position, there would be no escape. The operators knew it, and they kept transmitting anyway. Meanwhile, 30 miles to the north, the real battle raged. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, cut off, outnumbered, low on ammunition, low on supplies, no reinforcements, no escape, just one order: hold. German forces tightened the news, demanded surrender. The answer came back in one word: nuts. But defiance wasn't enough. They needed time. Time for General Patton. Patton was already moving, rerouting his 3rd Army north. 3 divisions racing through winter conditions, snow, ice, blocked roads. Enemy resistance. Every hour mattered. And Operation Kodak was buying those hours. For 4 days, German intelligence tracked phantom divisions. For 4 days, they adjusted plans based on false information. For 4 days, they reacted to something that didn't exist. By the time they began to question the signals, it was too late. On December 26th, Patton's forces reached Bastogne. The siege was broken. The 101st was relieved. The German offensive began to stall. Hitler's final gamble had failed in the Ghost Army. No headlines, no recognition, no credit. Because radio deception leaves no photographs. No visible evidence, just confusion and results. But the commanders knew. Bradley knew. Patton knew. Simpson knew. 1,100 men had helped change the outcome of one of the most critical battles of the war. After Operation Kodak, the Ghost Army returned to standard deception missions, but nothing felt standard anymore. They had seen how fragile the front lines were, how quickly things could collapse, how important their role had become. New operations followed. Operation Flaxweiler, Operation Landvillers, each one more refined, more precise, more dangerous. They had learned. Visual deception required perfect positioning. Sonic deception required the right terrain. Radio deception required flawless timing. And above all, everything had to match sound signals. Behavior wanting consistency, and the illusion would break. But German intelligence was learning too slowly, carefully. Patterns were emerging, questions forming. Why did some American units only appear briefly? Why did certain formations generate activity but never engage? Why did movements seem incomplete? The answers were getting closer. And when the Germans finally understood, the Ghost Army wouldn't be bait anymore. They would be the target. By March 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. German forces were retreating, cities were falling, supply lines were collapsing. But one major obstacle still stood between the Allies and the heart of Germany: the Rhine River. It wasn't just a river, it was a barrier, wide, fast-moving, heavily defended, the last natural line protecting Germany's industrial core. If the Allies failed to cross it quickly, the war could drag on for months, maybe longer. The U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross, but the Germans were expecting it, watching, ready to defend every possible crossing point. That's where the Ghost Army came in. On March 18, 1945, Colonel Harry Reeder received orders for what would become the largest deception operation of the war, Operation Viersen. The objective: convince German forces that the main river crossing would happen near the town of Viersen, 15 miles north of the real crossing site at Rheinberg. If successful, German defenses would shift north, leaving the real crossing point weaker, more vulnerable, easier to breach. But this operation would require everything the Ghost Army had, every technique, every trick, every lesson learned over months of deception. And they had just 4 days to prepare. From March 18th to March 21st, the unit moved into position. The scale was massive. Over 600 inflatable vehicles were deployed: tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, tank destroyers, all arranged in realistic formations, all placed where German observers could see them. From the ground, it looked absurd. Rubber machines, shaped completely fake. From the air, it looked like an army. Engineers worked around the clock, inflating equipment, repairing tiers, repositioning units, creating fake supply dumps, stacking crates, laying cables, everything a real army would do before a major operation. Sonic units deployed next, speakers hidden behind terrain, trucks positioned carefully. Then the sound began: engines, construction noise, troop movement, metal clanking, orders being shouted, not just at night, all day, all night, 24 hours a day. The goal wasn't just to create noise, it was to simulate preparation. An army getting ready for something big. Then came radio deception, the most complex there. Operators simulated 2 full-corps headquarters, dozens of subordinate units, thousands of transmissions, orders, supply requests, engineering reports, reconnaissance updates. Everything pointed to one conclusion: a massive river crossing was about to happen at Viersen. On March 21st, the operation went live. The German response was immediate: artillery fire, heavy, accurate, relentless. 155mm shells began falling across Ghost Army positions. Explosions tore through the ground. Shrapnel ripped through equipment. Men dove for cover. Within the first hour, 3 soldiers were wounded. A radio truck was hit, equipment destroyed, but the transmissions didn't stop. Operators moved to backup units, set up again, kept sending signals, because stopping meant failure. German reconnaissance flights increased. Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft circled overhead, taking photos, analyzing positions, watching closely. The Ghost Army had never drawn this much attention before, and that meant one thing: the deception was working, but it also meant something else. They were now the main target. For 3 days, artillery bombardment continued, constant, unpredictable, exhausting. Sleep was almost impossible. Men worked in shifts, repairing damage, maintaining the illusion, keeping everything consistent, because even under fire, everything had to look real. Then, on March 23rd, the real operation began. 15 miles south at Rheinberg, American forces moved toward the river. Engineers deployed pontoon bridges. Amphibious vehicles entered the water. Infantry advanced under fire, and something unexpected happened. Resistance was lighter than anticipated. German defenses were weaker, less concentrated, less prepared, because many of those forces were looking north toward Viersen, toward the Ghost Army. Within 48 hours, over 20,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine. A foothold was established, then expanded. The barrier was broken. General William Simpson, commander of the Ninth Army, later acknowledged the role of the deception. The Ghost Army had drawn German forces away from the real crossing, saving thousands of lives, but the cost had been real. 12 men wounded, equipment heavily damaged. 3 days under continuous artillery fire. It had been their most dangerous mission and their most successful. Operation Viersen would be the Ghost Army's final major deception. Within weeks, Germany collapsed. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war was over. The Ghost Army survived. Final record: 21 operations, 3 men killed, 48 wounded, 0 catastrophic failure. Every mission had worked, some more than others, but none had failed completely. Colonel Reeder assembled the unit on May 10th. 1,100 men stood together for the final time. Then he told them something unexpected. Everything they had done would remain secret. All records classified, all documents sealed. They were not allowed to speak about their missions, not to family, not to friends, not even to other soldiers. If asked, they would say they had served in regular units, nothing more. The reason was simple. What they had created was too valuable: inflatable deception, sonic warfare, radio manipulation. These were not just wartime tricks. They were tools for the future. And the military intended to keep them. The men signed secrecy agreements. Violation could mean court-martial. And just like that, the Ghost Army disappeared. The unit was officially disbanded on June 23, 1945. Exactly 1 year after arriving in France, they boarded ships, crossed the Atlantic, returned home, and said nothing. Artists went back to painting, engineers returned to building, designers resumed their careers. Bill Blass returned to fashion, Ellsworth Kelly to art Kane to photography, but they carried something with them, a secret, one they would keep for decades. Sergeant Bob Tompkins went home, told his family he had served in an engineering unit, nothing more. His diary, written in violation of regulations, was hidden away. Private James Anderson lived a long life. When he was finally asked about the war, he said something simple. The strangest part wasn't the danger, it was the silence. The silence lasted 50 years. In 1996, the U.S. military finally declassified the Ghost Army. Records were opened, documents released. Historians began to piece together the story. A filmmaker named Rick Bayer helped bring it to the public. Interviews were conducted. Survivors spoke for the first time, but by then most of the men were gone. They had lived their entire lives without recognition, without telling their story. In 2024, nearly 80 years after the war ended, the Ghost Army was finally honored. They were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. 3 surviving members attended, all over 95 years old. The recognition came late, but it came because what they had done mattered. Historians estimate they saved between 15,000 and 30,000 lives, maybe more, but the exact number will never be known because their weapon wasn't destruction, it was confusion. And confusion doesn't leave records, it leaves absence, the absence of attacks, the absence of casualties, the absence of death. Today, one of their inflatable Sherman tanks sits in a museum, 93 pounds of rubber, a weapon that helped win a war. The Ghost Army proved something simple. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not force, it's imagination.